Well, I think if you look at the independence movements after independence, what you wound up in terms of government were not elected governments, but governments that had kings, military, or ex-military. And that pattern in many countries, certainly in many Arab countries, has remained the same. You've got the monarchy states in the Gulf, and then you have other non-monarchy states, a country like Egypt, where it's basically been a military regime since independence was gained. It's a great irony that the U.S. Has supported authoritarian nations, but in fact, the U.S., like most nations, functions on national interest, and there was a strong belief that linked stability with security. And Arab states are called mukhabarat states, meaning security states, meaning that you basically have unelected governments, and for their legitimacy and security, which is tenuous, they rely heavily on military, police, secret police, etc. And that's been the pattern of many countries. I think when you see the kind of nature of many of the governments, the authoritarian governments, and the support for Western countries, one could realize that it's going to be very difficult to see democracy and democratization. The uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia and other countries are an example of this, particularly Egypt. Egypt had its first democratically elected civilian president. Some people, many people, had a lot of problems in the first year with a lot of his policies. That became an excuse, though, for the military and others to have, in effect, a military-led coup. Sadly, Western governments ultimately went along with it. The United States in particular, the Obama administration, declined to call it a coup, and then talked about democratization. And actually, if one looks at a Forbes article published in September 2014, it really demonstrates the extent to which the return to basically a military-backed authoritarian regime is actually worse than in the past. The level of violence, for example, in killing of civilians has been greater than has existed under previous authoritarian regimes. I think that when one talks about radical movements, in studies, for example, of suicide bombing across religions and across the world, what one sees more often than not is that it's usually political and socioeconomic issues that are the primary drivers. Religion then becomes a way to legitimate and to recruit. And in fact, that's what we often see. And so if you have deep-seated grievances, for example, you have an authoritarian regime. The authoritarian regime, in its repression and its violation of human rights, etc., is supported by Western governments. Then the Western governments are also come to be seen as an obstacle. Now, for your average person, you will have an anti-Americanism, as in fact you have globally, not just among Muslims in many countries, but that usually has to do with American foreign policy. But for movements that believe that their governments can only be taken out through radicalism and violence, then they target first their government, but they also target governments that are associated with the government. I think that a lot of people forget when it comes to the misunderstanding with regard to Islam. I mean, as I like to put it, I've been in this field for 40 years, and I get asked the same questions by the general public, but also often by some policymakers. And I think part of it is that there was virtually, prior to the Iranian Revolution, there was no great interest in Islam or Muslims. When I got into the field, neither diplomats nor the press, nor in education, were we covering the second largest religion in the world, and a religion that is found in some 56 countries. And also in those periods, in Europe and America, Muslims were pretty much invisible. You didn't have mosques, you didn't have Islamic centers. The engagement with Islam and Muslims in a significant way came with the Iranian Revolution. And Ayatollah Khomeini became a symbol for, if you will, revolutionary Islam. So for many Americans, the lens through which they first encountered Islam was through the experience of seeing people in the street yelling death to America, the taking of American hostages. And therefore, there was no context within which to make a judgment about or to know about what's happening in the broader Muslim world. That issue has continued So that a study that looked at 2001, 2011, 975,000 pieces of media in Europe and America discovered in 2001, 2% of the coverage was on extremism, 0.1% on the context, the broader Muslim world. 2011, 2% jumped to 28%, and the broader context remained at 0.1%. Much of the problem between Muslims and Christians historically is not directly related to the violence, but that memory certainly gets pulled up. And we find that even in issues of, for example, North-South issues in the United States, where we find it in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. But there is then a religious dimension to that. And so for some, they will talk about, for example, battles between Muslims and Christians historically. And, you know, one person saying, well, these were militant jihads. Well, for the other side, these are crusaders. And so therefore, when you have then the invasion and occupation of a country today, in fact, people say there's that pattern of the crusaders. And the reverse happens when it comes to Muslim actions. But usually if you look at the primary drivers, they're very often about issues of occupation. Occupation by foreign powers or occupation by an authoritarian regime supported by foreign powers. I think that if one is interested in perceptions of Muslims, it's very interesting. The Gallup organization in the from about 2005 to 2007 or 8, did a global study of most countries in the world, and 35 Muslim countries were also focused on. How did people feel about their life, their economy, their future? But they also, in Muslim countries, focused on issues of violence, terrorism, religion, etc. And what Gallup found was that, in fact, significant number of Muslims who might be seen, as many of them, as being anti-American in terms of our foreign policy, but not necessarily hating America, because many want to come and study here, etc. But significant numbers admire our democracy, our rule of law, work ethic, technology, education, and want that for themselves. But many of those Muslims do resent a double standard with regard to the promotion of democracy. That is, that's the one area in which we chose not to promote democracy. And also what they see is the denigration of Islam and of Muslims. And so, for example, the problem with Islamophobia today, that is anti-Islam and anti-Muslim rhetoric, hate crimes. And here I'm not talking about being critical about the religion. You know, if you have objective empirical reasons, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about bias and bigotry. That was there. The reverse, though, when you talk to Americans, Americans are proud about the very things that Muslims admire about us, but they're not aware that that's the way Muslims feel. 55% of Americans, when asked, how do you feel about the Muslim world or Islam, said nothing or I don't know. I think war on terrorism is not as bad as global war on terrorism, which gets exaggerated. I remember after 9/11, I was doing an interview on Fox television, and there had just been an interview with the heads of the CIA, the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, and the interviewer was asking me about going into countries. And so I tried to fine-tune this notion of global war. And she said to me, are you deaf? Didn't you hear them use the phrase global war on terrorism? That means we'll go any place in the globe. And it means there are 56 countries. The danger is you exaggerate the extent. Now, terrorism, we should have zero tolerance for. Terrorists are a small minority. They're relatively small groups, but they are obviously deadly and dangerous. But if you blow it out of proportion, you both feed, as it were, the drive, the ego, the reputation of the terrorist, but you also exaggerate and in effect not terrorize, but make your general population far more nervous and concerned than they ought to be. Now, I want to make it clear that doesn't mean that there can't be a terrorist action at any time, because we no longer have conventional wars, army against army. So it means you can have one person, a small group of people come in, they can cause a lot of havoc. And I think we need to draw a line. Well, it's very interesting. Muslims in Europe generally came as laborers. and they came from rural areas, they were workers. They went there to work as laborers, and they were welcomed as laborers, but the countries that often received them wanted them to work, and they expected them to go home. Many who came expected also to go home, but decided to stay. And what that meant, though, was that countries often weren't prepared to be thinking about educating, socializing a workforce in particular. In America, it's a different story. Decades ago, you had an initial wave of immigration in which people were coming for political asylum or simply to do better economically, and they came with educations. Then in the 70s, you had many Arab and Muslim countries sending many of their non-elites who were very bright to Europe and to America to get educations. Many of them came, and the idea was that they would go home, but in fact there was a brain drain in many cases. That is, many received a good education, could get a better job here. In some cases, they were professionals who had no profession back home in terms of what they did. And that's why today, if you look at America, American Muslims are economically and educationally totally integrated in a way that does not exist in Europe. In fact, the average Muslim makes as much as the average non-Muslim American, if not more. And educationally, the percentage of Muslims who are educated is significantly better than the average level of education of Americans in general.